Okay, so this is Parashat Shofetim. We're going to start with Shofetim. There's so much interesting to talk about in Shofetim, so I'm just going to isolate a couple of ideas that I think are critical for the parasha. Obviously, there's so many topics in Parashat Shofetim. It's one of those parashiot that has many different ideas that we can zero in on. So we'll try to take a few of them. We'll see how long it takes us to develop those ideas, and if we have more time, we can always explore some additional components. But Shofetim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol she'arecha. This is on page 1024 if you're following in the Blue Chumash. That judges and policemen you should place in all of your gates. Asher Hashem Elohecha noten lecha lishvatecha, that Hashem your God gives you for your tribes. V'shafetu et ha'am mishpat tzedek. So the opening paragraph of the parasha, after which the parasha is named, is Shofetim. Shofetim means judges. That you should have some kind of a legislative order. You can't have a lawless society. You have to have Shofetim. You have to have people who are ministering justice amongst the people. In other words, it's not enough just to have Torah. Torah is very important, obviously. You have to have laws, but you also have to have people who are in charge of applying the law, interpreting the law, enforcing the law. That's the difference between a shofet and a shoter. A shofet is somebody who interprets the law or makes a decision about the law. A shoter, a policeman, is supposed to be at least somebody who implements the law or enforces the law, makes sure that the law is being kept. Sometimes they can become confused as to what their role is. Sometimes a shofet might act like a shoter, sometimes a shoter might act like a shofet. But really, ultimately, the judge has his or her, his role. In our society, it could be a her, his role, and the shoter has his role. So if the shoter, for example, like one time it happened to me many years ago, when I was a new driver, that for the first time I had to drive pretty far. I had to drive like upstate from Long Island to like one of those Shabbat retreats. I forget exactly where it was, but it was like one of those like the Homowak or one of those retreats. And so I was very nervous because I wasn't I was a relatively new driver. I didn't really know what I was doing, and so I drove up there. I was going up there because my synagogue was having an away Shabbat. They were having like a Shabbaton, and they wanted me to come to read the Torah for them, everything that I used to do. So I came. I got a free ticket to the event. It was a good deal. So I went. So I drove up there, and on the way back, I'm driving back. Remember, there was no such thing as GPS, no such thing as cell phone, no such thing as anything. I had to remember the directions. Okay. And I realized my exit was coming up, and I was in the wrong lane to get at the exit. And I said, "Oh my gosh! If I pass this exit, I'm going to be totally lost. I have no idea where I am. I'm never going to make it home." So I kind of made a quick change of lanes over 2 lanes that maybe was risky, and I ended up getting rear-ended by the person who was driving the right lane. There was no real bad damage or anything like that, but they were very they were upset. I was upset, but I realized it was my fault. I wasn't, So what happened was a police officer came to the scene, and the police officer wrote me a ticket for the lane change. But the only problem was that the officer wasn't there at the time that it happened. They can't really give you a ticket, for something that they didn't see, or at least they're not supposed to. So I ended up having to go all the way back up there to make an appearance in court, and of course, the police officer didn't show up. So fortunately, I was off the hook for the ticket. But that's an example of a police officer going too far in their. It's just the first example that came to mind of an officer going too far in their application of the law. They're supposed to enforce the law, not legislate, not make a decision beyond what their immediate job is supposed to be. Although there was a really funny story that happened during that time, because you see interesting things when you go to traffic court. I'm sure none of you have ever been to traffic court. In Nassau County, you have to appear. Yeah, you have to appear, and you have to get a plea bargain. I remember because it happened to me also once on what's the name of that road? Seaford Oyster Bay Expressway, right? So one time it happened to me on that road that crosses between the northern state and the southern state, that I got a ticket when I was a kid, because it's a speed trap, and I remember, when they made me do a plea bargain, even though I didn't want to. I just wanted to pay the ticket and not go to court, but they made me. So anyway, I was in court, and this funny thing happened. So when I went upstate, back up to the court, so I was the last person on the list. I was sitting there forever, and you get to hear all the other cases. And sometimes people are really creative with the excuses they give for all the traffic violations. It's actually entertaining. So this one lady gets up. I've never forgotten this. This one lady gets up on the stand. She's called on the witness stand. They had like a real court. It wasn't like the county courts that we have here, but it looked like a real courthouse. So you went and you sat up there, and the lady's telling the story of her, her day. So she goes. She says, so the judge said, was questioning, so tell me what happened. You weren't speeding, so what happened that day? She said, well, I got up in the morning, got out of my car, I was on the road. She said, I was driving on the road, speeding, just sipping my coffee. And so he's like, guilty. Next. Confession of guilt. Next. Yeah, be careful. It's Freudian slip, right? Freudian slip. The truth comes out. Everybody in the courtroom, was laughing. It was funny. It was funny. Anyway, even she was laughing. I was like, oh well, I lose. So anyway, so shoftim v'shotrim. Because that's the only experience I have with courts. Because obviously I have never committed a crime worse than that. So they have to be placed in all of the gates. Now, obviously, it's a sign of a just society. The idea that every city in Israel has its own courthouse. It's not just a practical matter, but it's a matter of principle. It's supposed to signify and symbolize a just society, a society where rule of law is extended to every place, every city. When you have only let's say, a central court, so what happens is local disputes, can sort of disintegrate into tribal infighting. There isn't a local court to take care of the small things, and people are not going to go to the Supreme Court to take care of every little thing that goes on. But when you have a courthouse in every area, in every municipality, in every county, in every area, you're going to make justice available to all. And that's the idea in the beginning of the parasha. And it goes on to a lot of tangents, or what would seem to be tangents. It talks about not planting a tree next to the Mizbeach, not putting up a matzeva, not putting up a stone to bow down on the Mizbeach. These things, and then it gets into idolatry, and the reason why that's mentioned here is discussed by the commentators. I want to just skip to something that's actually really, look at 10:26. Here's something that it's so fundamental to us as observant Jews today to understand this parasha, because anytime somebody asks you, well, I don't really believe in Judaism. I believe in the Torah, but everything is made up by the rabbis. They make up all of the rules, they make up all the laws, they interpret everything, and we're following them. We talked about this the other night also in one of the other shiurim, that people oftentimes bring this objection, especially the old-timers. A lot of times they say, listen, I believe in the Torah, I believe in what Hashem said, but all this interpretation and all this rabbinic thing, I don't believe in that. So when we look at the Torah itself, it's very interesting. Would it really work? The question is, would it really work to have just a book but no people to interpret it? Okay, and even the Torah itself on 10:26 here, Pasuk Chet says, Ki yipalem mimechad davar lamishpat. When something is too remote or hidden from you with regard to judgment, ben dam ledam, between blood and blood. Blood here, according to Rashi, is talking about, they argue about whether a certain type of blood is pure or impure. Because we know when it comes to the blood of certain types of blood can be pure versus impure, that a woman might see in her monthly cycle. Ben din ledin, between one judgment and another judgment. And again, Rashi says that ben din zakai ledin chayav. In other words, there's an argument on the local level about whether a certain person is innocent or guilty, meaning that the judges are not able to reach a conclusion about it. Or ben nega la nega, they can't decide whether a certain spot appearing on the wall or on somebody's skin. A nega usually refers to tzara'at, okay, but it doesn't have to be. The point is that they're arguing about certain halachic matters, divrei rivot bisharecha, matters of argument in your gates. This is the way that Rashi interprets it. That what it means is that you have a disagreement about halachic matters. So what do? Do you just let the people follow whatever opinion they want? Do you just let people follow whoever their rabbi is? No. They had a way of dealing with this, which was, you should get up and go to the place that Hashem has chosen. Now, what does this show you from the very beginning about halakha? What does this show you about the Torah? Did Hashem think everything in the Torah was self-explanatory and everybody's always going to agree on how to interpret it?
No.
Slichot here?
No, I can't cancel.
Huh?
Can't cancel.
If you want to set it up, you can do it here if you want.
Today?
Get people, 10 guys. It's up to you.
They're going to try. So from the very beginning, the idea of different interpretations is even written in the Torah. Most people feel that the Torah is self-explanatory, right? Most people, they'll say, the Torah is self-explanatory, and then the rabbis, they come with interpretation, and they start arguing with each other, they start, fighting with one another over what the Torah means. No, it says right here, Divrei Rivot Bisharecha. There are going to be matters of argument in your gates about the Torah. Even Hashem, even Moshe Rabbeinu knew that there was going to be argument. Not only that, there was argument even in the Torah between Aharon and Moshe. Moshe and Aharon have a machloket in Parashat Shemini about what should be done with certain sacrifice, whether it should be burnt or it should be eaten. When Aharon decided to burn it, and Moshe said, no, that's the wrong thing. And then Aharon convinced him he was right. So you have difference of interpretation and opinion, even in the Torah itself, between Moshe and Aharon. Certainly, in the future, there's going to be disagreement about halakha and about Torah. So no system of law will ever be without disagreement when it's put into human hands. If you could ask Hashem the answer to every question, that would be a different story. But Hashem didn't want the Torah to be something that was dependent upon divine revelation all the time. He wanted it to be a living tradition that human beings would study and understand and interpret and apply and learn themselves. Not that they would constantly be reliant upon revelation. In fact, it says in the beginning of the book of Yehoshua that thousands of halachot, the Midrash says thousands of halachot were forgotten during the Yemei Evlo Shel Moshe, when Moshe was, right after Moshe died. And Yehoshua went to Hashem and said, Hashem, I want the answer to these questions. We can't remember the answer that Moshe told us. And Hashem said, no, I don't give any more halachot. You got to figure it out yourself. And so they worked on it. They did research. Otniel ben Kenaz was the guy who did the research, and he came up with answers to all the questions. He was able to restore the original halachot. But the idea is that the human mind is supposed to be an active participant. We're not just receiving the answers from Hashem. We're supposed to be studying and learning and revealing it ourselves, revealing the truth ourselves. So when any system is in human hands, we're not perfect. So therefore, what's going to happen is you're going to have, from time to time, machloket. Now, if you look in the Talmud, in Masechet Chagigat, says that for generations there was only one machloket between the Chachamim that they couldn't resolve. Every other one they were able to resolve. Over time, there was a proliferation of opinions. The Talmud says that at a certain stage in history, the students of Hillel and Shammai shelo shimshu kol tzorkam. They did not disciple properly. They didn't serve their teachers enough. They didn't learn well enough. So therefore they had even more arguments. But that's why Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are famous for having lots of arguments. Hillel and Shammai, the originals, they didn't have that many arguments. But Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the schools that they founded, had lots of arguments because the students weren't as great as the teachers. So when you know less, of course there's a lot more room for argument, right? When things are very clear, you're on a very high level of knowledge, there are less possibilities. You see things more clearly. When your mind is befuddled and you don't have that level of knowledge, it's easier for there to be arguments among people. That's why if you look at comment threads on any article online, there's a bunch of, there's thousands of fools, with a million opinions because they don't know and nobody knows anything. But amongst scholars in a field, if it's a real field, look at, in real fields of science or real fields of knowledge, there are differences of opinion. But they're usually a select number of different of opinions. There's not infinite number of opinions because people who know a lot about the subject have less options for what they're going to be willing to say as a legitimate theory. They can't just say anything. They actually know what could or couldn't be true. They're not just making it up from their seat at home in front of their computer that they haven't, gotten up from for months as they've been on the internet arguing with people, But with the people who really know something have less opinions. In other words, the scholarly community, the more of a real discipline it is. Like in the sciences, for example, where there's really rigorous training involved, those people don't have 500 opinions. There are disagreements in theory, but not 5 million opinions. In halakha, you have so many opinions because the Gemara says the Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel didn't serve their teachers enough. They didn't get to the level of their teachers, so they ended up having a lot of things unclear. And when you have a lack of clarity, it breeds more machloket, more disagreement. Okay? And that's what the Gemara says. But even with the highest level people, even with the greatest chachamim, even with the people on the top, you can have a machloket. You can have machloket, and the Torah even says there are going to be times you don't know the answer to a question, so you have to go to a higher level. Uvatala kohanim halviim v'yela shofet asher yeh bayamim ahem. You should go to the kohanim, the Levites, and the shofet, the judge that is in that day. V'darashta v'gidu lecha et devar hamishpat. And you will seek, and they will tell you the matter of the judgment. In other words, they will give you a ruling, a final ruling that you can rely upon. Now, the question, of course, that the Gemara asks is, it says you should go to the judge that is in your day, right? Bayamim ahem. What's the alternative? Can you go to a judge that's in a different time? You certainly can't go to a judge in the past that's already gone. You can't go into the future and ask a judge. So, of course, Ela shofet asher yeh bayamim ahem. Of course, the judge you're going to consult with, just like if I say consult with your rabbi, I don't mean consult with the rabbi from 500 years ago. I mean consult with the one now.
Some people might say my rabbi is Rambam.
Right, some people might say that. That's why I'm glad that you said that, actually, because that's kind of the thing I was thinking of. So in the Torah it says V'yela shofet asher yeh bayamim ahem. The question is, can your rabbi really ever be the Rambam? Okay? It could be that you view the Rambam as the source that you want to follow, but could your rabbi can't be the Rambam. Do you know why? That's not the only reason. What do you mean? When did he die?
You can't.
No. Yeah, no.
You can't ask him questions based off what he says.
You can't. Which means what? Right? That's true. You can't ask a question. Which means what? He needs to be living and know what's going on. But what's going to happen if I open up a book? I open up the Rambam's book from 800 years ago and I read it. That's exactly right. I'm going to be interpreting the book, aren't I? In other words, someone's going to be interpreting it. There's a fallacy in saying I go according to this book. What do you mean you go according to that book? The book explains to you the answer to your question, or you read the book? You have to read the book, and you have to understand it, you have to interpret it to apply it to your situation. You can't just, there's no such thing as a book. There's an interpretation of a book. A book is just letters on a page. It's just words on a page. You're going to interpret it to be able to apply it. So someone's got to interpret it for you, somebody alive. And many of the people who say the Rambam is my teacher, they just read the Rambam according to their own understanding. So it's not really the Rambam being their teacher, it's their understanding of the Rambam being their teacher, which somebody else who reads it might say that you're wrong about your interpretation. So they're not really. So what I'm saying is that you need an interpretation right now. You might think you're following it exactly what the Rambam says, but that's your interpretation of the Rambam. It might be right. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't try to interpret, but you might be right about what you're reading and what you're understanding. But the fact is, it's an interpretation in your mind that you are developing from that reading.
So my question is, you have to go according to the book, or you have to go according to the person who's alive?
You need to go according to the Torah, but you need to have a living person who's interpreting it for you. So the big mistake.
Rambam. Nobody can become a Rambam. I cannot become Michael Jordan.
I didn't say.
Like you can.
You have a better chance of Michael Jordan. But the point that I'm saying is not that your teacher is going to be the Rambam, but you need someone who understands what the Rambam is saying. He's going to interpret it and teach you how to understand it. Right, Parshanot, exactly. Always. So what was the mistake? What was really the mistake that the Karaim and all of these people who rejected Torah Shebaal Peh, what was the fundamental mistake really that they made? Was that they believed that a text could stand on its own without interpretation. So what ended up happening to Karaim? What happened was they threw out all of the rabbinic interpretation, or much of it. They didn't throw out all of it, but they threw out a lot of it. And what happened? Did they follow just the book? No. They ended up developing their own schools of interpretation. But instead of them being limited by some fundamental Torah Shebaal Peh, they have tons of different schools of thought that are totally divergent. They have those that say that you're supposed to have arba'at haminim on Sukkot, and some that say no, that you're not supposed to have them. There are some that say you're supposed to have a mezuzah, some that you're not supposed to have. Some that say they have such fundamentally divergent views about the halakha because they don't even have a basic Torah Shebaal Peh, because they got rid of the basic Torah Shebaal Peh. So what do? They can't live without some kind of interpretation. So they replaced it with their own interpretation. But since they didn't have any common agreement on what the interpretation would be from the beginning, like we do, we at least have the Talmud, we have the Mishnah, we have the Talmud. You can't go on your own without that. So we at least have something that limits the amount of machloket we could have. So the Karaim, they didn't have that. So what ends up happening is they develop widely divergent, totally fundamentally divergent views about from when should you count the Omer, when should Shavuot be, which Shabbat are you supposed to count the Omer after, the Shabbat of Pesach, the Shabbat after Pesach, the first Shabbat after the barley harvest starts, which one? So they have you could have the holidays on 3 different days, even with that.
Didn't they die out? I feel like those type of people were
No, they're still around. So, or like, what do you blow on Rosh Hashanah? It doesn't say shofar in the Torah. Maybe it means a horn. Or maybe it just means crying out with prayers. It doesn't say to fast on Yom Kippur. Maybe it just means to beat yourself with the whip. It says to afflict yourself. I mean, when you don't... Now, they happen to agree with us that it means fasting, because usually they look in the Tanakh to prove what the words mean. Okay? But as I had mentioned the other night, I can't even remember which shiur it was that we had, that, there are many examples of... I'm giving so many shiurim now, which Baruch Hashem, it's a good thing, but I can't remember which shiur I said this in. So if you heard this already, please forgive me. But there are many examples from which we can see that Torah Sheba'al Peh is necessary for understanding what the Torah means, to teach us. And one of the examples that I always give, I used to have these Jehovah's Witnesses that used to come to my house every Shabbat, every other Shabbat. I, being a nice guy, always let them in. They would come over and they would sit with me for hours. They would sit trying to convince me of their religion. They have a special, I didn't, present myself as a rabbi. This was we're talking, I want to say 15 or 16 years ago. I would let them come in, maybe 20 years. I would say, probably 18 years ago. Yeah, so I would let them come in. And we would sit down. Sometimes they would send 2 people, sometimes 3 people, 4 people. They brought some guy from the home office, and I don't know where, some other state, to try to argue with me. And they would come every other Shabbat. They're nice people, but they were really insistent. And they have a pamphlet for every religion. So if you're a Muslim, they have a pamphlet that's designed to convince Muslims, and it looks like it uses all kinds of references to Islam. For Jews, they have it looks like it quotes Rashi, it quotes the Talmud, it tries to make you feel at home with it. They have people research this stuff, I'm sure. So they would talk to me about that, and we would talk about the Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's a big thing for them, especially for Christians in general, that they reject Torah Sheba'al Peh. They don't want the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Why? Because Jesus was very against the Torah Sheba'al Peh, because of course the rabbis rejected him. Yeah. So he doesn't want their tradition to be true, and also in the New Testament many times he contradicts them and says they're making up the laws and all that. So they're very against the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So we were talking, and I gave 2 examples that I think are the most compelling examples of why you need Torah Sheba'al Peh. One of them is that it says Lo taseh melacha on Shabbat. Don't do melacha on Shabbat. And it says to give the death penalty for that. Now, without a good working definition for something, how could you give the death penalty? One guy's work is another guy's pleasure. One guy's working in his garden, he thinks it's so enjoyable. Another guy's working in the garden and he thinks it's hard work and he's doing melacha. You're going to do it totally subjectively, or do you have guidelines? If you have guidelines, where are they in the Torah? But there's an even better example. If anybody ever challenges you on this, I'll tell you what to tell them. This is the example that I use that they couldn't get around. Which is, it says actually, coming up very soon, hold on, that when there's an argument between people in court, okay, and they judge between the two, and they decide between them, it says, "V'aya im bin hakota rasha." It will be if the person who is wicked, meaning the person who is judged to be guilty in court, is bin hakot. Do you know what bin hakot means? Bin hakot means he should get whipped, right? It's in next week's parasha in Perek Kafei. Where is this? This is in Parashat Kitzitzei Perek Kafei. Okay, page 1062. It will be, if the person is worthy of lashes, then the judge should cast him down and strike him. Okay? 39 times, right? Where it says arba'im yakenu, right? 40 times. We do 39. So I asked them, this is a very nice law. Who is a person worthy of makot? That's my question. It says v'haya im bin hakot rasha. It will be if the person is worthy of getting lashes. So who's the person who's worthy of getting lashes? They said, well, it must say somewhere else in the Torah. It doesn't say anywhere else in the Torah who's worthy of lashes. It never says anywhere, these are the people who should get lashes. It never says you should lash this person. It just says if the person's worthy of lashes. How is the judge supposed to know? He just makes it up. He just makes up if he thinks the person's worthy. It doesn't say that. It says, Im bin hakot harasha. That means if the person's worthy, there must be some standard. Where's the standard? It doesn't say who's worthy. It's like just giving them a whip to whip people with and not telling them when they're supposed to use it. That's not just. So they said, well, there must have been other books that they had that had these laws. I said, exactly. It's called the Talmud. That's the Torah Shabbat. That's what they had. Right? So they had a hard time with that. But that's the best example. It's a clear instruction in the Torah that there's no guideline. There's no guideline anywhere for who's supposed to be whipped, and yet it says if the person's whipped, you should whip them only 40 times. Where's the indication of who those people are? It doesn't say anywhere except in the Mishnah. You need Torah Shabbat Peh to know that. And what ends up happening with the Kara'im is lehavdil. Not that they're this bad, but if you've ever learned anything about Sharia or about fiqh, about the Islamic law, they have also a similar phenomenon because the Quran is not written in clear, in sort of legalistic, clear statements the way that the Torah is. So they have very, very, very wide divergence of opinion on very basic things in their religion. So, for example, that's another story. We have that too, but they have one opinion that says hilchot nidah, for example, the tarat mishpacha that they have. They have family purity of nidah. So some say this is the rule. Some say this is the rule. Some say that there is no rule. You don't have to observe it at all. It's like, so how could you have a mitzvah that some people say doesn't even exist, and some people have a very strict interpretation of it? So they have a very wide divergence, and the Kara'im end up with a similar kind of thing. But in any case, so it says that we should do according to the Shofet in our day. Why in our day? Because anything is going to be an interpretation in your day. And you can only go by the best interpretation available to you in your day. You can't go by the interpretation of the past, because in order to get to the interpretation of the past, you're going to have to interpret something. In other words, it's always going to be a mind that exists now making the decision. So what it means is you should go to the person with the best mind, the best understanding that you know now, that has a living, breathing Torah in his mind, that he's able to interpret for you and apply for you the halakha, because otherwise you're really doing an interpretation on your own without even realizing it. And that's what the Torah is telling you that is going to happen. So this is what keeps the Torah alive, the fact that we have interpretation. And you are going to do according to what they tell you. That's what you're going to do. That is what the Hashem wants you to do, what they say. That's the amazing thing. So do we have any guarantee that they're right every time? No 100% guarantee. It doesn't say that whatever they say is correct. It says you have to do it. So it could be that Bet Din will make a certain decision. A later Bet Din will come along and say, we reverse the decision. Could happen. Or it could be that they would even recognize they made a mistake. There's an entire Masechet the entire Masechet is not devoted to this, but there's a Masechet in Talmud that much of which deals with what happens when the Bet Din Gadol makes a mistake and everybody follows it and says, oh whoops, we just all messed up big time because the Bet Din made a mistake, made a ruling that a certain thing was permitted, we all went and did it, and now we realize that we just did Avodah Zarah. Or we just all violated Shabbat. Or we just all ate something non-kosher. So what do we do now? The Bet Din messed up. The Bet Din misled us. So from that halakha, we see that it's possible for the Bet Din to make a mistake. We don't assume that they're never going to make a mistake. And yet the Torah still tells us to follow what they say because that's the best that we have. And the Ramban says that there's not that there's a guarantee that they're going to be correct, but that Hashem does give them. There is a providence for the Chachamim that they're going to reach the truth. It might be that they make a mistake first, but ultimately that they'll be helped by Hashem to get to the truth. So that's the best bet that we have. But it has to be Asher Yabayamim Mahem. And so what do the Chachamim say? They say Yiftach b'doro ki Shmuel b'doro. You might be in a generation where the best leader is Yiftach. Yiftach was the reason why they gave that example is because Yiftach was not a very good leader in his time. He was left much to be desired, let's put it that way, in the book of Shofetim, as opposed to Shmuel, who was amazing and awesome and the greatest person since Moshe Rabbeinu. So it says Yiftach b'doro ki Shmuel b'doro, which means that don't think Yiftach is any less of an authority in his time because he's not as great as Shmuel. Because guess what? You can't talk to Shmuel right now. He's not available. You need to go with the person in your time. Go for the best. Seek the best. But you have to seek the best in your time. And that is what Hashem wills you to do. Hashem doesn't say you need to have the absolute truth. That would be impossible for us. If Hashem said you need to have the absolute truth, then we would be in a lot of trouble, because unless we had somebody who had the highest level of understanding, unless we had Moshe Rabbeinu around for all eternity, we couldn't be guaranteed of having the absolute true halakha in every single case. We wouldn't be able to have it. So Hashem built into the system that no, whatever the highest and best understanding of the Chachamim in your generation is, that's what I want you to follow. It will evolve. It might change. The Talmud talks about Batei Din that had certain rulings. For instance, a very practical one about Shemitah, about the 30 days before Shemitah, where the Bet Din Agadol ruled for many, many generations that the 30 days before Shemitah were biblically forbidden, just like Shemitah itself, as we're coming into a Shemitah year now, you know. So, and then later Bet Din came along and said, no, it's not true. We reject that interpretation. It's not biblically prohibited. So all those years, they were following the view that it was. Then it changed over to it wasn't. How does that happen? Because the Bet Din is supposed to do their best to understand the Torah based on the tools that they have, even if it means disagreeing with the previous Bet Din. And they're not allowed. It says, Lo takiru panim b'mishpat. Lo takiru panim b'mishpat means you're not allowed to show favoritism in judgment, which means they're not allowed to say, well, we really respected the people before. They must have been right. No, it has to be something that makes sense, that you understand. In other words, not you personally, but that the Bet Din understands and sees as being correct. What is the proof of that? The proof of that is the very famous story about the Tanur Shel Achnai. Famous story about the where the Bat Kol comes supporting Rabbi Eliezer. Everybody knows this story, right? Where the Chachamim are arguing. Rabbi Eliezer rules something pure. The Chachamim say it's not pure. Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let the water flow backwards. It flows backwards. Let the tree be uprooted. The tree's uprooted. Let the walls of the Beit Midrash start to fall in on us. The walls start leaning in to show that he's right. Then he says, let a voice from heaven come and say that I'm right. And a voice from heaven comes and says, he's right. And yet, what did the Chachamim say? Lo b'shamayim hi. Sorry, the Torah is not in heaven. Thank you, Hashem, for your opinion, but we still have to rule based on what we see as true. So that's an extreme example, obviously. What it means is that even if we knew what the right answer was, this is the amazing thing, and that's what's so revolutionary. Because you might say, well, this is only, what might you think? This idea of having a Bet Din in every generation is only a compromise. It's only a concession to us because we don't have access to God's cards. We can't see what Hashem is really thinking. But if we could, we would follow that. That's what you might think. That story is trying to tell you that that's not the case. That story is trying to tell you, even if you knew what Hashem thought, but your study of Torah, the Bet Din study of Torah, leads them to a different conclusion, they don't see why Rabbi Eliezer is right. They hear his answer, they hear what he's saying, they hear his argument, they hear Hashem supports that argument, they know that that's the right answer, but because they don't understand why, they can't explain it, they don't grasp it, they don't see it as the truth of the Torah, they can't follow it. They have to follow what they see as the truth of the Torah to the best of their ability. They can't just take his answer because they happen to know it's right. It has to be what they see with their own minds and their own developed understanding as being correct. Otherwise, you end up with a situation where revelation is making the decision instead of the living tradition of Torah. So that's really the radical idea in that story. The radical idea is, it's not only that Hashem is saying, since you don't have access to the ultimate answer, you should go with your Bet Din. He's saying, even if you had access to it, I want you to go with your Bet Din. Because otherwise it undermines the whole idea of Limud Torah. The whole idea of learning Torah is that we are investing to the best of our ability in understanding the Torah to the best of our ability, and we're supposed to follow that Torah to the best of our ability. And if we're not up to that absolute answer, even where we know we're not up to it, we still have to follow what makes the most sense. Otherwise, we're going to be following arbitrary answers given to us by revelation. We're not going to be following what's authentically true to our minds right now. We're not going to be true to our minds right now. And that's what Hashem actually wants from us, remarkably. And that's why at the end of the story it says, Nitzchuni banai. My children overthrew me. Right? Which He wants. He wants you to go with what the Chachamim see as true. He doesn't want us to turn to Hashem for the right answer. And that's the uniqueness of the Torah. That what makes. So then everybody asks, well, wait a second. So then how is following the Torah following the will of Hashem? since Hashem has one answer, and what did they do? All of the things that were prepared in the ovens that Rabbi Eliezer said were good, they burned all of them because they said they're tameh. They're impure. What do you mean? Hashem just said it's pure. Why are you burning them? No, we ruled that it's impure and we don't see it His way. We see it differently. Our process of thought, our process of research led us to this conclusion. So then how are we following the will of Hashem if we're explicitly ignoring what Hashem says the answer is?
Created the system. So it's in place.
Right, so our commitment is to the system of Torah. Our commitment isn't to a specific halacha. Specific halacha could be one way, could be the other way. The Beit Din would decide. There could be a machloket about it. Beit Shammai could be right. Beit Hillel could be right. Rabbi Akiva could be right. We don't know what's in the mind of Hashem. Our commitment is to the system of Torah. We do want the truth. Ultimately, we have to work on getting there, right? We have to work on getting there. But right now, what we...
Know the truth or just have an interpretation? Why?
That's only assuming that the value of knowing the truth is just a piece of information. Right? That it's just a piece of information. But really, the value of knowing the truth is that you've developed an understanding of Torah that leads you to that truth. Not just that somebody hands you the answer. Somebody just hands you the answer, you don't really understand it. You're just taking it from the outside. That's not what Hashem wants. Hashem wants us to be committed to the process of understanding Torah and therefore going with the best chachamim that we have available to us at any given time. And that's what He does well. So you are following the will of Hashem, even by going, so to speak, against the will of Hashem in that story. And that's the funny thing about it, ironically. Because it's Hashem's will that we not listen to what His answer is. Now, I wanted to show you one other really fascinating thing about the parasha. And that is the appearance of a lot of Kohanim. There's a lot of Kohanim in this parasha. For example, what we read already, it said you should come to the Shofet and the Kohen. Right? You should come to the Kohanim Halaviim Bi'ala Shofet Asher Yeh Bayamim Hahem. You should come to the judge and also to the Kohanim. And Rashi says that it was considered a mitzvah to have Kohanim on the Sanhedrin if possible, and that's the halacha too. So Kohanim though really, and it says on page 1026 that if you have this machloket, you should come up to the Kohanim Halaviim. Then it says later on, right after that you are going to choose, you're going to come to the land of Israel and you're going to say, Asima alai melech, I want a king. Does a king have anything to do with Kohanim?
No.
Not really. In fact, the king is not allowed to be Kohanim. He's not allowed to be a Kohen. But what does it say?
It have to be only Shevet Yehuda.
Right, of course, that wasn't established yet at the time of the Torah, but still. So in Yud Chet, it says, Vayachish Shivto al Kisei Mamlachto. When he sits, this is on page 1028, verse 18. When he sits on his throne, V'chatav lo et Mishnei Torah hazot al sefer. He has to write a copy of the Torah on a book, meaning in a scroll. Milifnei haKohanim halvigim. Where is he going to get the Sefer Torah? From the Kohanim. Why can't he just get any Sefer Torah? There's other Sefer Torah around. Why does he have to go there? Interestingly, the Kohanim come in here.
Let me ask you a question. Moshe Rabbeinu or Yosef HaTzadik, they were the king. They were not within Shevet Yehuda. How can they be the king?
He wasn't really a king of a monarchy. He was just a leader. He was a leader. Now, if you look at the next page, 1030, it says, Lo yeh lekohanim haleviim kol shevet levi chelek v'nachla im Yisrael. The Kohanim don't have any portion in the land. V'zeh yeh mishpat haKohanim me'et ha'am. This is going to be the judgment of the Kohanim from the people. V'chiyavo halevi me'achad she'arechad mikol Yisrael. And it talks about the Levi coming and serving in the Beit HaMikdash. So there's a lot of talk about Kohanim and Levi'im. But what's interesting about the Kohanim is they appear even in places that they don't belong. Like when it comes to judgment. Is a Kohen more qualified to judge a case than a regular person? Not necessarily. If they're Talmid Chacham, if they know the law, yes. If they don't know the law, why are they? It is true that it says Yoru Mishpatecha LiYaakov v'Toratecha LiYisrael, that the Kohanim and the Levi'im are supposed to be the ones who are responsible for teaching the Torah. That's very important. However, it's not exclusive. It's not like he has to be. Shemuel was not. Well, he was a Levi, but he wasn't a Kohen. And many examples of teachers of Torah. Yehoshua was not a Kohen or Levi, and he was a teacher of Torah. There were many teachers of Torah who are neither Kohanim nor Leviim. And we see yet Kohanim appear. So look at the next. If you look at the next section, actually talks about the Navi Sheker. So let's go past the Navi Sheker and go over to the.
When did the Kohanim have time to do that? Because they were working the Beit HaMikdash the whole time. Then how can they be?
They only had to work 2 weeks a year, so they were okay the rest of the time. So if we turn to page 10:34, it talks about the kohen, the person who kills by accident, right, and has to run away to the Ir Miklat, as we already know, and we know that he exits when the kohen dies. But it doesn't. But on 10:36. On 10:36 it says, "Lo yakum ed echad beish l'chol avon o l'chol chatat." One witness should not rise up for any sin or any other anything like that. You have to have 2 or 3 witnesses, right? In verse Yud Zayin, in verse 17, "V'amadu shnei anashim asher lehem ariv lefnei Hashem lefnei kohanim v'hashofetim." That when the people come to judgment, they come before the kohanim and the shoftim. They come before the priests and the judges. Why the priests? Why the kohanim? They're not necessarily judges. Why are the kohanim being mentioned? Look on page 1038. 1038, they go out to war. Okay.
We talked about before when the kohen gadol come and they release them, right?
That is true. But that's true. Now on page 1038, it talks about going out to war. What happens when they go out to war is V'aya kekaruvchem el hamilchama v'nigash hakohen v'diber la'am. They're going out to war. The last thing they want is some religious guy to come. They need to focus on war. They don't want some guy talking to them about some Divar Torah, right? They're not thinking about that right now. But a Kohen comes and he starts saying, "Listen, don't be afraid. Hashem is going to be with you. Shema Yisrael." Shema Yisrael reminds them, of course, Hashem is one. Hashem is the one who's going to make this happen for you. And then if anybody has an exemption to go home, that is introduced. But that's the Shotrim are going to talk about that, the policemen. But the Kohen comes and he gives them some chizuk. He gives them some inspiration. Reminds them, Hashem is in charge. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. Right? And then it talks about but again, why is a Kohen going out with them to war? Why do we need the Kohen? And it's actually a specific Kohen. It's called the Mashuach Milchama. They would actually anoint a specific Kohen for going out to war. Mashuach Milchama. It's like what we say today, chaplains, right? They send chaplains out to war. Mashuach Milchama. Actually, I gave a few years ago, I was invited to a convention of rabbis, and they had a lot of chaplains, and I spoke about this. The concept of chaplaincy in the Torah. You see here the idea of a kohen accompanying, and Pinchas goes with the soldiers out to war. Now, in the next time that we see a kohen appear is on 1042. 1042, you have the situation of the Egla Arufa. The situation of the dead body that's found. The homicide has been committed and we don't know who killed the person. And so what do? They go to the closest city. They measure from all the cities. They figure out what's the closest city. And whoever the elders of that city have to come, they decapitate the cow in this place. And then they have to wash their hands and say, we didn't have anything to do with this. But who are the ones who come? Why are the Kohanim coming to a homicide scene? They're not the policemen. They're not the FBI. Why are the Kohanim?
They're asur to go to the dead body.
They're not going to the dead body. They're going to the spot where it was found. They're going for the Egla Arufah. They don't go to they don't even go necessarily there. They go to a place that was never worked. They go to a Nachal Etan, right? They go to some kind of unsown valley. So it's not the place where the dead body was found.
Cover or something?
What? No, they find the body. That identifies which Zikenim are going to have to come, but that's not where they do the ritual. Whoever, I don't know, a hiker, somebody was taking a stroll with their dog, found it. I don't know. Whoever reported it. They found out what the closest city was. They come to do the ritual, but who comes? Kohanim Levi'im. Because Hashem chose them to serve Him and to bless in the name of Hashem. And according to their word is going to be every argument and every nega, every plague. In other words, all things are going to be under the jurisdiction of the Kohanim. Very interesting. So the Kohanim have their hands in everything. They have their hands in the legislature. They have their hands in the Beit HaMikdash, obviously. They have their hands in the king. The king has to come to them for the Sefer Torah. They're involved in the military. They're involved when a homicide has been committed. The Kohanim are all over the place here. What is the idea of this involvement of the Kohanim? It's very interesting. The idea of the involvement of the Kohanim is very, very important. And we can see also even a little wisp of it at the beginning of the parasha.
Wow, that's trouble.
Yeah, because in the beginning, and they don't get, and the pay is not so good. Yeah. And if you look at the beginning of 1024, we had asked the question of why is the first thing that it talks about in Shofetim about idolatry, right? The first judgment it really talks about executing somebody or bringing people to justice is people who commit idolatry. That the Bet Din has to have 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses in order to bring them to justice, so to speak. Okay, that's the first case of Shoftim. It starts not with a case of murder, not with a case of judging thieves or property or anything that's more typical, let's say, in a civic society, but it talks about idolatry first. And the Ramban comments that the reason why it talks about idolatry first is because this is really this is the essence of Judaism. The number one job of the Shoftim is to ensure that Judaism and Torah is preserved. And so if we look at it that way, why are the Kohanim infiltrating every aspect of society? To show you that even the civil dimensions of our society, in other words, even our legislature, even our resolving of a homicide, even the way that we approach the military, everything is Avodat Hashem. We have the people who are representing service of Hashem in all posts in our society in order to remind us that those components of a government that are generally the most secular, you could say, right? They're the ones that have the least to do with religion. What does judgment in a court have to do with religion? We have laws that we have to, the laws came from Hashem. But how does applying the law to this case, 2 litigants come, how does that have any relevance to Kohanim? Okay, how does the establishing of the monarchy have any relevance to Kohanim? The point is it does, because every time a Kohen is involved, that symbolizes this is Avodat Hashem. This is service of Hashem. Why are we having judges, establishing judges? Why are we insisting on justice? Because that is how our society serves Hashem. And that's why one of our main judgments, the first judgment that's mentioned, is against idolatry. Which reminds you that what is the primary point of these judges? What's the primary point of having this legislature, having this group of Shoftim? The primary purpose is to establish a godly society, a society that recognizes and serves Hashem. Yes, there are many other details. They also have to deal with petty squabbles about money, and they also have to deal with all kinds of other disputes and all kinds of other halachic matters. But everything that they do has to connect to Avodat Hashem. It's all, you can get lost in the nitty-gritty of halakha. When somebody asks you a question about, is this Muktzah on Shabbat, they're not just thinking so much about the Ribono Shel Olam. Right? They're not thinking so much about Hashem when they ask those little questions. So it's easy to forget, these little questions, these halachot, let me check the Teudah and see if this is kosher. How does that relate to Avodat Hashem? It's easy to lose the forest for the trees, right? You're involved in the details. People sit in yeshivot all day long. I remember one rabbi telling me, I learned for many, many years, and I don't think I thought about God very much. For many years until I got older. People forget that they're learning to serve Hashem. They're not just learning a bunch of technical rules. But it's easy when you think legalistically, when you think halachically, when you're learning Shulchan Aruch, when you are learning to become proficient in the guidelines of Jewish life, to forget that this is Avodat Hashem. What's the purpose? So the Shoftim have to be connected. The Melech, it's easy for a king, even David HaMelech could forget sometimes what his ultimate purpose is. Even Shlomo HaMelech, we know about that. We learned about the Midrash about Shlomo HaMelech a few weeks ago, right? That he lost sight of what his ultimate purpose was and got involved in all kinds of distractions. Why? Because he forgot that the whole purpose of my monarchy is to build the Beit HaMikdash. I shouldn't be distracted by these other things. My whole purpose is Avodat Hashem. And how do they show that? By copying a Sefer Torah from the Kohanim. Not just any Sefer Torah, but from the Kohanim, who are the representatives of service of Hashem. When we go to war to defend ourselves or to expand our borders, whatever we're going to war for, we're doing it in some way. It has to connect to our mission of serving God. If it doesn't connect to our mission of serving God, we shouldn't be in the mission. Okay, it's not something relevant to Torah. And even when we try to solve a murder, even when we hold people responsible, or we ask Hashem to atone for blood that's been spilled in our gates, it's part of our Avodat Hashem. The Kohanim come. Everything in our society, whether it be ben Adam l'chavero, between fellow man, or it's between Hashem and us, or it's justice, or it's things that seem mundane, or it's war, or it's government, or it's the monarchy, whatever it may be, everything has to tie in. The thread that ties everything together in this parasha is the Kohanim. The Kohanim are present everywhere because they tell you that all of these different elements of society, not like in our secular society, that there's separation of church and state. So, chas v'shalom, that you have anything religious in a courtroom. So I knew a judge, he passed away a few years ago. He was one of the most brilliant people I ever, his name was Judge Siegel. I spent many Shabbatot with him when I was a teenager, because the place where I used to pray and I used to read Torah was far from my house. So a lot of times I would just sleep over at the rabbi's house and spend the whole Shabbat there, and because it was a long walk. And I spent many Shabbatot. He was one of the most brilliant people I ever met, and he was a judge, and he would wear a kippah all the time, but he wasn't allowed to wear a kippah when he's judging, because it looks like, it doesn't look right that a judge has a kippah. So he used to take off his kippah. There was like a statue of whatever, like, I don't know who next to him. So he would take off his kippah and put it on there.
You put it on the statue?
Yeah, the statue. I don't think they like that either. But the point was, there's a separation of church and state, right? There was this whole argument about, the 10 Commandments in a courthouse and all that we read about. But the Torah is saying the opposite. It's saying, why do you have a just society? Why do you have a king? Why do you have military? You have all of these things in order to serve God. That's why you have Kohanim involved in everything, because they remind you, what's the purpose of this? It could become something separate. The power of the king could be separate. The power of the legislature, the importance of the details and pilpul of halacha could become its own thing separate from God. You're not serving God anymore. You're serving pilpul. You're serving Shulchan Aruch. You're not serving Hashem anymore. So you have to keep in mind that all of these elements of life tie back to service of Hashem. That's the most important thing, and that's what Parashat is telling us.